Sound and data.
So I was doing the dishes and I was listening to Marketplace on NPR and I heard Jordan Wirfs-Brock on the Marketplace channel talking about the sonification of different data. And I said, oh, I've got to reach out and call her up. And she graciously decided to be a part of the Sound and Data catalog here. And so here's my interview with her. I apologize for the quality of my recording. There was a technical problem on the call, but the interview was so good that I just tried to cut out most of my stuff and just let her talk because she's just has some brilliant ideas that you should really check out. Here you go. Sound and Data channel grew out of me just wanting to talk to the people that are working in the field and exchange ideas. So rather than have a formal setup where I've got a series of questions I'm going to ask, we're just going to talk about what led to your interest in this, Jordan. How did you start? I mean, give us some context about where you're coming from.
Yeah, so I'm currently a PhD student studying kind of interesting and weird ways to represent data that are accessible to people. But I really got into this because I used to be a journalist, and I was a data journalist, which when I started doing it, that word didn't even really exist. That job position didn't really exist. But over the course of my time working as a journalist, it kind of became this hot new thing. And I found myself working in radio. And I would do all these projects where I would, spend months analyzing data to have it end up being like one sentence in a radio story, and then like linked to an online visualization, or something like that. And so I really got into sonification because of this problem of like how to get data journalism on the radio. Particular kind of background and context, I'm really focused on on the explanation part, which is why I'm glad that you brought up the that portion of the Marketplace segment, because that's kind of my focus now, is how to explain sonifications, how to teach people how to listen, and really this kind of learning to listen part of it, in addition to just the design of the actual sonifications themselves.
I mean, we did a whole thing. It still hasn't come to fruition all the way, but we really wanted to integrate in our sonification practice the idea of training the listener. As part. So I had this thing, LETS, which was like learn, explore, test, and then repeat. You learn, explore, test, learn, explore. So you learn what's going on, like, oh, the violins are the tides of Venice, or whatever, and because if you don't know that, it just sounds like some violins, you always need some sort of orientation. Whereas, and this is interesting, I found this thing, I think I've repeated this over and over again in these interviews, but there's the first time they did a visual graph that was like an XY graph, there was a 10-page explanation. In other words, the people that were using what we now take for granted, that the x-axis is time and the value.
Right.
That required 10 pages of explaining to whoever was going to look at this graph now it's so we have the same problem, I think, with sonification. But I was going to say, in terms of the data journalism, I did a thing at CINMAT at UC Berkeley called Crossroads. It was a convergence of sonification practitioners, which if I'd known you, I would have definitely invited you to come to that at the time. But there's a Sindhya Rangacharan and Jim Briggs work for Reveal News, which is centered in Emeryville.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and she's the data reporter. She identifies as a data reporter, and Jim Briggs is their sound guy who also does computer music stuff, and so
yeah. Well, one of the first. The first sonification project I ever did, I was working for a radio collaboration called Inside Energy, and I found this piece of Python code that a guy named Michael Corey, who worked at Reveal at the time, had written to sonify earthquake data in Oklahoma. And so I took his code and used that to sonify coal production data. I think he's no longer at Reveal, but I think it was kind of cool that at the time there seemed to be kind of this eagerness of people in radio to really pick up some of these techniques. And at the time, like, we didn't even know what to call it. And I think that's also one of the reasons that it was hard to really get into this field and to learn how to do it, and then to learn how to teach listeners how to listen to it, was like not even knowing the words to like look up and find the communities of people that were doing this. Was like a big challenge at the time.
I had a really interesting conversation. Have you ever heard of Mark Bolaro? He sponsored the ICAD, the International Conference of Audio Display Conference, at the Penn State in the middle part of Pennsylvania. But he worked with Mickey Hart, actually, doing data sonification that Mickey Hart used behind one of his Emmy-winning albums and stuff like that. I had a really great conversation with him, and his whole thing was, we can't expect people to be using these things, and what I'm focusing on now is teaching this generation to think of listening to data as a thing to do, and then expecting them to take the ball and run with it and integrate it into the ubiquitous multimodal data representations that'll be happening in the future, which was really interesting. I mean, this is the first time I heard that perspective.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I really appreciated about Marketplace was they originally found my project on Twitter, of all places, and I had made a video where I kind of walked through and explained how to listen, and they're like, let's do that on the radio. Let's walk through and like teach listeners, and having Kai Risdal, who's the host, kind of stand in for the listener and ask questions. And so I really appreciated that they were, from the get-go, that they were willing to use that sort of dialectic, teaching structure to present the work. And so I think that actually worked really well.
Yeah, my thinking lately is to go ahead and have a channel where that's what it's about. Rather, I mean, interviewing, sure, but like working with novice listeners. I mean, I think it'd be a great idea to do something besides just the sort of more down in the weeds kind of working with the actual. It's more like we're talking to the animators and not with what I do with this channel is it's more like I'm just talking theory and ideas, and I don't even.
Yeah.
I often don't even put up pointers. I figure if somebody's listening to it, they know how to Google, they can listen to this person's work. So the thing I heard was on Marketplace. Why don't you talk through what that was, and so we can talk about kind of down in the weeds about what was really going on under the hood.
Yeah, so you'll have to remind me again. So I actually did 2 pieces for Marketplace. So one was on the Dow Jones stock market, and then one was on unemployment data.
The unemployment one.
Okay, we're talking about the unemployment one. Okay.
And I haven't even heard the other one, so I feel bad.
Oh, cool. Well, I can send that to you. Because the Dow Jones one, that was the one that they found on Twitter, and then the unemployment one actually was one that they're like, hey, we would love to do another sonification.
Well, great.
Yeah. So.
Man, that's great. It's getting the, it always astounds me that this isn't a more prevalent thing, actually. You know what I mean?
But yeah, with that one, the challenge was to capture the level of unemployment claims that have been filed since the beginning of the pandemic, which, if you've been paying any attention at all to the news, we're just kind of astronomical.
Yeah.
And to the point where like it was so hard to even compare to any historical data because it was just so massive. And people have done some interesting things visually. Like I think the New York Times had like a front page of their paper where they used the entire vertical distance of the front page as the y-axis. So it was like this small graph of weekly unemployment claims, and then you get to the recent data and it just like shoots up the side. So it's kind of a similar thing to the Al Gore like carbon hockey stick graph where he in his movie where he like gets on a a riser and it like lifts him up because so basically you have this scale that's just, if you're gonna look at what's been happening in recent weeks and months, it's basically going to drown out everything that's happened in the past because it's not even comparable. So that was like one challenge, is how to put it into context that's meaningful when you have this scale that is just, the range is just so large. And then the other challenge was how to capture sort of two ideas: the new claims that were being filed each week, and then also the ongoing unemployment. So like the people that are still unemployed and have been unemployed for many weeks. And so how to capture kind of the current change and then the cumulative effect. And so those were kind of the challenges that I was wrangling with when I started to to create that sonification.
Yeah. Well. And I thought it was very effective, but I think you touched on two things that I'd kind of like to talk about, since I was down in the weeds, and that's what this is all about, sort of. And that is this idea of scale and how to represent scale with sound, and how to disconnect from visual thinking with sound. In other words, we tend to, most all of sonifications are a lot of times representations, as was yours and a lot of the ones I've done, of the basic XY Cartesian plotting of something. And what happens is that this idea of scale becomes really weird because we don't have a point of reference, like you do visually. You can really see it, but you do. I mean, you can hear things go really up high into the stratosphere frequency wise. Anyway, what do you think about? I mean, when you're thinking about scale, how did you use a log scale for the frequency changes, or did you use exponential, or how did you do that?
Yeah. So I'll complicate that by saying there were two issues of scale. Okay. There's the issue of the magnitude of the unemployment claims. Right. So how big does it get? But then there's also the time scale, right, which is, if you really want to look at context, you need to look at like, how does this compare to the 2008 recession? How does this compare to even the Great Depression? And so my original idea, which I didn't end up doing, it was kind of like a crazy wild, if I could do something, that wouldn't end up on the radio, would be to actually use that time as a design feature. So like the Marketplace show is 20 minutes long. And so I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if like they could start at the beginning of the show, and then it's kind of like, oh, we're going to do 50 years of data over 20 minutes, but just kind of like interject in at certain points of time and be like, now we're in 1970, now we're in 1980, and it would just kind of like pop in. And so it would kind of like produce this feeling of like, oh, there's a lot of time passing, and like that for a lot of reasons wouldn't work for the radio. But when I was kind of like brainstorming, I was like, wouldn't it be cool to do something so that people have this like prolonged engagement?
Yeah.
Didn't end up doing that. I ended up having to compress.
Where did you go exponential frequency wise, which was
exactly, yeah, and with that, I ended up having a linear scale, not a logarithmic one, and it's just for the simple reason that it's easier to explain. Right. And on the radio, you have to be able to explain it in like 3 words. Yeah. So that's for that. Yeah.
Jim Briggs wrote this choral piece, actually. I don't know if you go on Reveal, I can send you the link, but they did this really cool thing where they had a choir singing. God, what was it about? Well, anyways, it was socialized, some social thing. It was about gender and race equality among CEOs of Silicon Valley companies, I think was the thing. Mm-hmm. And they basically had different, women's voices representing the women, and, I think, or something like that. I quite remember. But it was very effective to use humans singing, as the thing. But the two issues of scaling, both things, this touches on the huge problem of just this XY representation as sound, which is really the predominant version of sonification. There are other things. I mean, Thomas Herman has a lot of what he calls interactive sonifications, which are basically ways that explore data. I do that kind of thing too, but that's a different thing. But if you're just listening back to something, the time scale is a really interesting one, because the things that you have to do is usually compress the time scale. especially
Yeah.
talking about astrophysical data or, something that's going from 1938 to 2020. Of course, you have to, you can't wait years to hear it. There's that famous John Cage piece where they change the note on the organ once a year.
Yeah, and it's like those things I love to think about them, and they're definitely like I am inspired by a lot of kind of I guess more wild and kind of critical sound experiments.
Right.
But when you're dealing with a medium like radio or podcasting,
Yeah.
the reality is you have to capture people's attention and you have to do it quickly, and people are going to be listening in their car, they're going to be listening while cooking, so they're not going to.
I do kind of like the idea of doing a radio show. Like what would be maybe cool, and I should maybe think of this in the future, is just have it in the background for an entire interview. And that's kind of music for airports kind of background thing that wasn't too obtrusive. But
exactly. Yeah, that's what I originally wanted to do. I was like, oh, wouldn't that be cool if it was just kind of like underneath all the other stories, and so you could kind of like check in, but it would be there. So to kind of give this, this. But anyway, so I didn't end up going that direction. So the direction that I ended up going to kind of capture this idea of time scale was just to do comparisons. So to say, okay, here's what things sounded like in 2009, actually, because that's when the Great Recession was at its peak in terms of unemployment. And then here's what things sound like right now in 2020. So to do this temporal comparison, you don't get to hear all the years in between, but you get to hear these snapshots.
Right.
And by hearing them, you can contrast them. And so although you don't get that kind of duration, okay, this is how this unfolds historically, you still get that kind of comparison. And then to deal with the magnitude issue, we can talk about that one as well. So
wait, I'm curious. So how do you realize your pieces? You mentioned Python before. Are you using Python for data scrubbing and then sending it over to something else, or how do you do that?
Yeah, so I use Python to do my data analysis in Pandas, and Jupyter Notebook is sort of what I typically use. And then I am often like exporting the data to use another tool for sonification.
So that other tool then, does Pandas export like comma separated value?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
And so the other tool is like Max or PD or something, or?
In this case, I used a web browser-based tool called twotone.io that I think Google actually bought, or we should check this, but I think Google now owns it, but it's called twotone.io, and it's just like a browser-based, it has a GUI, graphical interface, so you can, and you could just do frequency mapping, like that's all that it does, but it has a nice interface for doing it. Since those pieces, I've started playing with Sonic Pi, which is a live coding environment that I think is actually based in Ruby that does a lot of the same things. So I play around with that. I've done a little bit of playing around with Super Collider and other languages. Like I kind of bounce around from tool to tool depending on what project I'm actually doing. So one of the things I'm working on now is trying to kind of like get expert at least one tool so that I can if you hadn't been able to tell yet, my strength is not being a sound designer. I'm not a musician. My strength is in kind of storytelling and explanation and narrative. So I'm new to the sound design stuff.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I used to be a professor type, so I was publishing a lot, and one of the articles that gets the most hits of the stuff I was writing was something. Oh, what was it? I forget the title of the paper exactly, but it's like sonification and sound art, like comparing the two things, because it's really interesting for I mean, you clearly have a good idea of how to communicate using musical sound. I mean, that was clear from what I heard, and so the moment at which you start making those kinds of decisions are very different than the act of using pandas to turn and figuring
Yes.
log scale or linear scale and blah, blah,
Yeah.
all that stuff. And then on top of that is the data reporting aspect, which is even before that, which is like, well,
Oh yeah.
what's interesting, what's the thing that needs a story told about it, and how is that story going to be told,
Absolutely. And that's like even selecting what data to use, which in this case, that was that discussion that I had with a producer at Marketplace about like, what data do we want to convey? Right. Is it the new claims? Is it the continued claims? And we ended up going with both. And those are really important discussions that when you take classes and, whether it's information visualization or in sound design, like they don't tend to focus on those skills of like, what is the right data? Like, is this the data that will be meaningful to your audience?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean,
those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'm always studying new stuff as it comes up. Like you mentioned Jupyter Notebooks. We linked C-Sound to Jupyter Notebooks and was able to do a whole series of sonifications using the C-Sound scores in the context. But it was such a pain. It was ridiculous. I mean, it was really not something I would inflict on anybody else. And then I have a colleague who I've interviewed on here named Marco Buongiorno Nordelli, he's a physicist, a material science physicist, an amazing composer and flautist, and he just like works with Jupyter Notebooks every day, all day. And he was able to do it in an afternoon, just like sit down and blah, blah, blah. I think it like took us months of sweat and tears to get it to do.
Yeah.
He was already, this is great, and he's, thanks for telling me about it, and he's like, he sends me all the links, and he solved all the problems we were having, and it was like, oh God, So I understand that sort of like, this ends up being such a cross-disciplinary sort of endeavor, which kind of explains why it isn't more ubiquitous.
Right. Yeah, and so that's a good point, because I think that applies not just to the data processing, but also to working with sound. So the other element in that piece, in the unemployment piece, was the continued complaints were these drum sounds that I layered on top of each other. And
I remember that, yeah.
I did all of that in Adobe Audition, because that's the sound editing software that I used to using from working in radio. Yeah. And it was taking all these individual clips and like layering them on top of each other by hand. And in some cases, speeding them up or slowing them down so that they would fit. And like, that's something that I had to do it by hand. And then now that I'm starting to learn this live coding language, Sonic Pi, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's something that I could do programmatically. And so I could turn this like hours of work into like a few lines of code. But I didn't know at the time. Like I didn't know another way to do it. And I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. Like I think you actually gain a lot of design experience and help build intuition. But when you have to make things by hand, same thing with visual design, I think, like when you're sketching. I think those kind of tools where you can't necessarily do everything with code or with writing a piece of code to do it actually can be very useful from a learning standpoint, I think.
Okay, so I'm curious about, this is really informative for me just because I have all these assumptions about where people are coming from and that kind of thing. So Sonic Pi, I know the history of it very well, because it's actually built on top of Super Collider, which the real like computer nerds that I would be working with would have been using Super Collider since it was invented by James McCartney, who later worked at Apple and has since left Apple, and like there's a whole history there that I know about. The guy's name is Sam something that started Sonic Pi, and I came across that when I bought a Raspberry Pi, and that's why it's called Sonic Pi. They got some kind of money from Oxford to teach school children about live coding, and this guy made this whole Sonic Pi environment out with a basis in it's kind of a simplified version in the same way that P5 on JavaScript is a simplification of Tone.js. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but those are two very similar types of projects too. that P5 is mostly known for its graphics, but now it has like a sound library that can be used with it.
Oh, okay.
But it's interesting to hear your path. So what's your degree, the PhD you're working on is in data science then, huh? Is that?
It's in information science.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, and my department, because information science, a lot of people don't know what that is. A lot of people within information science don't really know what it is. My particular department is very human-computer interaction focused. So it's a new department. It's not one of the kind of ones that came out of library science. This one came out of interdisciplinary HCI work. And yeah, so it's
Sonification should reside, in my opinion. I mean, it's it's an HCI thing. I mean, isn't it? I mean, it's alarms and alerts, really, on a certain level. If it's used effectively at scale, I'm not talking about these radio pieces, which is actually where it resides now. I mean, the only time you hear about sonification is some YouTube video or some radio piece on either Reveal or Marketplace.
Yeah.
And I mean, and the other one, there's a guy, I can't remember his name right now, but anyway, in Australia, who pointed out that the Samsung washer and dryer actually plays different melodies for each of the cycles, which is kind of thing you would expect to be more integrated into our IoT kind of world, our Internet of Things kind of world.
Well, and that's like when people ask me kind of what my research is, and I explain to them what sonification is, I always inevitably have that conversation where I'm explaining to them all these sounds that their devices make all the time that they aren't really conscious of as containing information, even though it does have information in it. They're just not conscious of that process. So that's kind of how I end up explaining to people. I'm like, when your phone beeps, or you go to the dentist and they have all these tools that have sounds in them that help them out and things like that.
Yeah, well, I got so sick of having to explain what the term sonification meant, I started referring to it as ways of listening to data. And people get that right away.
I like that.
I know, that's why I started using it. It was like I didn't have to, I was already there with them. They kind of, ways of listening to data, okay. And they call that sonification. And so you kind of pre-explain, the thing, because people are asking on. But anyway.
So what I'm working on now is actually the ways to help people learn to listen. And I'm doing that using voice assistants, actually. So like Alexa or Google Assistant. So basically, I already had this interest in voice assistants and voice technology. And I also had this interest in communicating data using sound. And so now I'm working on sort of how you might bring those two together through kind of a conversational interaction that helps someone sort of learn to listen as they're interacting with it. Like, on the Marketplace piece, I could kind of have this back and forth with Kai Rizdal where I'm kind of telling him how to listen to it. When I make videos, I can kind of explain that one, but how do you create that experience in a way that someone could kind of dig deeper and interact without having me there as the creator, right? So you could use, a voice assistant to kind of stand in and help with some of that onboarding process and that sort of explanatory process and that kind of guiding you through listening. So that's kind of the direction that my work is heading in. So I'm still creating sonifications, but then I'm also focusing on this sort of interactive explanation piece of it.
Oh, wow. It's very in line with what we were working on. We integrated, and I'm curious if you're doing this, cognitive testing, so that we would have a training session, and then we would do some standalone cognitive testing to see if the training had worked at all.
Totally.
Are you doing that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, no, so that's part of it, right? So like incorporating as you listen things that are knowledge checks or quizzes of comprehension, right? So you wouldn't say to a user like, we're going to do a cognitive test right now. It would be more like, do you want to check to make sure you got it? That type of thing.
Yeah. I mean, we were getting IRBs and doing it in, crazy. I wasn't in control of that part of it, and
Yeah.
I appreciate your approach better, and I think I've been advocating with my working group that we really should be using, I think, Alexa and Google Voice, and I mean Google, the Google Home stuff more.
Yeah. Well, I think there's just a huge missed opportunity there because there aren't a lot of non-speech sounds in most voice interactions. I mean, there's more than there used to be. So like now when you're designing for a voice platform, it's fairly easy to put in a sound effect or a sound clip. And so you're starting to see that a lot more, but it tends to be with using actually non-text to speech voices. So like a human voice recording that's interjected, not a lot of non-speech sounds. And so I don't know. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. One point before I lose this is on your point of the sort of comprehension or cognition checks. I think there's kind of, I think part of literacy, there's two pieces. There's the interpreting it, but then also being able to produce it. And so one idea I have in that space is if you ask someone like, oh, what do you think? So you've just heard a sonification of March through May unemployment data. What do you think June sounds like, or something? Or you ask someone to like produce a sound. That could be really weird and scary, but I think it could also be very cool. And one of the places where I got that idea is there's this really great podcast called Switched on Pop, where they analyze music and they sort of explain how to listen to it. And a lot of times when they're kind of dissecting music, they're explaining a chord progression or a moment where the rhythm changes, and they're explaining it. They actually like reproduce it with their voice as a way of like sense making and like checking the comprehension. Right. And so I think there could be ways to like make this kind of voice enabled explanatory sonification to make it more fun and more engaging. Like if you actually ask people to like produce sounds as well. So that's more on the like experimental, further out into the future side of things.
So that's a really great direction that we've experimented a little bit with. I mean, we were referring. Okay, so there's a problem I have with the general definition. If you look up sonification in Wikipedia, it says non-voice or non-text based. I forget exactly.
Yeah, non-speech sounds.
Non-speech sounds. That's,
yeah.
And I think that's why. It's like what would be better than to have a speedometer, for example, or some indication of the change in barometric pressure that's just a little bit of a opening of a filter or something that you're hearing very slowly over the course of the day, and you just get used to understanding that that's what it is. I just read in this book I was mentioning, I don't know if it was when I was recording, I'm reading this Desert Notebooks piece by Ben Ehrenreich, which is a completely off-topic thing. But he had this section where he talked about something that really made me think about all of this, and that is that the Chinese had something they called an incense clock. And what it was a clock that different incenses burned at different rates, and so they would light all the incense at the beginning of the day, and the room would smell different at different hours.
Oh my God, I love that.
That's like, wow, yeah, I want to do that.
I love that.
I want a sonification thing like that. Oh, the Dow Jones just spiked, because suddenly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's no, I love that you bring up that example because I mean that kind of speaks to kind of my approach in philosophy is this kind of like developing a sense, right? A way of using your senses and your ability to perceive information from multiple sensory inputs. Right. And also just like I don't know. I don't know if intuition is the right word, but you develop over time when you look at when you interact with data a lot. Like you develop the ability to interpret it, right, and to draw meaning from it. And that's just a process that kind of takes time. And so I think if you have I don't know, whether it's an Alexa skill or a Google Home app that you use kind of every day and can like kind of help people build this sense of how to interpret the data that they're listening to. So that would be like one of the dreams.
Something for the Apple Watch too, that just did a little like burst that was like told you the weather, you know, so you knew what the rain sound was, and so you know you would hear, well, whatever, you know, it's going to be intermittent showers,
Yeah.
or whatever, and you know you always knew that a day was like, you know, whatever, 10 seconds long, and you know, so you'd know that you're hearing from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or whatever, and whatever, you know, that's not a real thing. It's just like a pipe dream. But anyway,
Yeah.
well, this is really right up my alley. Your work actually ends up. I was immediately attracted to giving you a ring. But well, let's not go on forever. We're already 40 minutes into this, so I think what
Sure.
we do is just plan on meeting up again and having another
Yeah.
conversation a little bit later. And I know, really, thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to the Sound and Data channel and digging into
Yeah.
your actual research and everything. So,
Yeah, this has been super fun. I really hope we get to talk again in the future and
closing,
share more crazy ideas.
anything you want to talk about, or any future work you want to talk to others about, or anything?
No, I just think it's great to continue to have conversations about doing strange things with data. So yeah, I hope you keep having those conversations on this podcast and elsewhere. And I think the way that we build our senses for being able to understand and use data is by talking about them and having conversations about it. So
it's a very recursive process. And
yeah.
The other thing is we can all look forward to your dissertation, right?
Yes, that'll be someday, another year or two. So
yeah, I know it goes, believe me. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll call it, that's it then. Thank you so much, Jordan. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
Sound and data.